Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm David Wu. Welcome to the Money Game, where we make actionable predictions about the big stories shaping the world today. If you're interested in making money, you're in the right place. If you're not, this program is designed for anyone who's interested in learning about what makes our world tick. Please subscribe at davidwuunbound.com if you haven't done so already. And by the way, don't be shy. Send me an email whenever you have any idea about what I can do to make this program better. Before we start the program today, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, in particular my belief system with respect to international politics. It is important for you to know where I'm coming from so that you can place my views in context. Nobody can have a wholly objective views about politics, not even me. So here's my political philosophy. 1, I'm a nationalist. This is despite the fact I'm a citizen of 2 countries and a resident of a 3rd. I think a healthy dose of nationalism is a good thing. It helps bring people together and make them aspire to something greater than themselves. I'm a Zionist, I was pro-Brexit, and I'm against open border. 2, I'm strongly opposed to national chauvinism in its every form. I don't believe one nation ever has the right to subjugate another. 3, I believe in free and fair competition that makes every country stronger. 4, I used to think that democracy is the best way to organize our political life, but the last 2 US elections have made me think otherwise. 5, I'm a realist. I think government should be judged by their results rather than by their means. 6, I'm a big admirer of the Chinese philosopher Mengzi, who said that not only people have the right to overthrow unjust rulers, but that the rulers are subordinate to the people they serve. That said, now let's turn to the main topic today. Is China going to invade Australia and Taiwan? Well, I'm going to tell you today why I think there's 0 chance that China is going to invade Australia. And I'm going to tell you that the only way China is going to invade Taiwan is if the US were to make a grave miscalculations that unfortunately I think the Biden administration is capable of. Preparation for war seems to be the main theme in Asia at the moment. First came the news last month Australia decided to purchase 8 nuclear power submarines from the United States. Then came the news that a record number of Chinese airplanes penetrated into Taiwanese airspace. All these things are fueling speculation that China maybe is getting ready to invade Australia and Taiwan. The question is, does this make any sense at all? Because China and China's decision-making process are opaque compared to other countries. The rest of the world have a tendency to see China in black and white terms. Look at these 2 popular representations of China here. One image suggests that the Chinese economy is soon to collapse. The other suggests that China is about to take over the rest of the world. It doesn't take a genius to know that both cannot be true at the same time. General public doesn't even have the most basic understanding about China. For example, is China rich? Well, the media would like to tell us that it's just a question of when now before China overtakes the US in terms of the size of its economy. Or is China poor? In fact, its per capita GDP is only $10,000 versus $60,000 in the US. Is Beijing a terrible dictatorship that abuses human rights and allows for no voices of dissent? Or is Beijing a benevolent regime that actually has raised the standard of living for its people by tenfold in a space of just 20 years? Is China's Belt and Road Initiative, a global infrastructure program funded with Chinese money, going to enhance regional connectivity, as Beijing keeps telling us, or that it's going to actually promote a new form of colonialism, Chinese style, according to many of Beijing's critics? Many people are suspicious of China's motive. They believe China harbors imperial ambition. So what is imperial ambition? Here we've got a map of the Roman Empire. Clearly this map speaks to imperial ambition, because at the peak of the Roman Empire, Rome had conquered most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The map of the Spanish Empire also speaks to imperial ambition. Spain, at the peak of its empire, had conquered most of the Americas, that constitute a landmass that was greater than 10 times of the size of Spain. What about the British Empire, the greatest empire ever in world history? At the peak of the British Empire, 25% of the world population lived somewhere under British rule. In fact, the British Empire had extended to almost every corner of the world, touching every continent, talking about imperial ambition. So let's now take a look at the map of the Qing Empire, the largest of Chinese empires. Now, of course, it includes core China, as was under the Ming Dynasty that the Qing Dynasty had overthrown. It includes Manchuria, which is where the Qing emperors came from. It includes Mongolia, which had been at war with China for thousands of years, in fact, had only conquered China 300 years earlier. And it included Tibet, that at the time viewed itself as a protectorate under the Chinese. And in orange, you've got a bunch of tributary states that China didn't even bother to annex. If I look at this map, I would say, not a very impressive empire. If China did not set out to conquer the rest of the world, it was not because it couldn't. China was a leader in many aspects of military technology, including naval technology. China invented the balanced ladder that was adopted by the British fleet, 1,700 years later in the 1840s. China invented the stirrups with which Mongol horsemen went on to conquer the Middle East, and for that matter, basically Russia. China invented the gunpowder with which Europeans colonized Africa and Latin America. Indeed, in early 15th century, Chinese naval fleet sailed all the way to East Africa, which at the time was the longest journey undertaken, by sea. And when the ships returned to China, they were burned down because the Chinese, truth be told, were not interested in the world outside. They largely regarded the world outside as being inhabited by barbarians, and they weren't particularly interested to have anything to do with barbarians. If China was not interested in the rest of the world simply could not leave China alone. The history of modern China is one of a series of invasions by foreign powers. For example, in 1839, China was invaded by Britain that got its hand on Hong Kong. In 1990, Russia invaded China and got its hand on Manchuria. In 1937, Japan invaded China and began an 8-year occupation of vast swath of Chinese territories. Look at 20th century foreign conflicts in which China was directly involved in. It was never about territorial ambition or expansion. For example, the Korean War. China entered into the Korean War in 1950 only after the US had ignored Chinese warning of a red line by crossing the 38th parallel line. That raised fears in Beijing that MacArthur's real aim was to actually continue on to Beijing. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam only to prevent Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia. In 1962, China and India fought a short war over a Himalayan border dispute. What this chart shows you is that only 200 years ago, China was the largest economy in the world. It's understandable the longing of the Chinese people to regain their rightful place in the world. But we should not confuse that with desire or aspiration to world domination. As I discussed 2 weeks ago at length, China faces many problems, not least of all collapsing birth rate, aging of the population. China could very well basically grow old before it gets rich. But one of many problems China faces is the fact that it's burning through its natural resources very quickly, as you can see on this chart right here. What this means is that for China to sustain its 4, 5, 6% growth rates it will become increasingly dependent on imported resources. Beijing needs to secure a lot of resources in order to sustain 5% plus growth rate in order to continue to raise the standard of living of ordinary Chinese people. This is what is ultimately driving the One Belt, One Road initiative to access material. And for that matter, China's interest in South China Sea. Underneath South China Sea, you've got 14 trillion barrels of natural gas and somewhere between 16 to 33 billion barrels of oil in proven reserves. South China Sea is about the dream of energy independence. Chinese expansion in the South China Sea cost China a lot of goodwill around the world, but it certainly dealt a death blow to its relationship with one of its most important trading partners, Australia. How this came about was less obvious though. Until 2018, Australia actually allowed foreign donation to political parties, believe it or not. By 2015, Chinese-linked businesses became the single largest source of foreign donation. Donation was made to both parties to influence Australian policy over the South China Sea issue in favor, of course, China. When this came to light, the Australian public was horrified by what was seen as China trying to influence through back channels, Australians' internal public debates. As a result, the relationship between China and Australia has been going into a downward spiral for most of the last 5 years, culminating in the decision to purchase American submarines. This brings us back to the original question: will China invade Australia? From a Chinese perspective, the question is, what would China achieve exactly by invading Australia? Sure, it's going to secure some resources, but guess what? Australia is very, very far away. In fact, it's 6,000 kilometers far away. It's more than half the distance to the United States. Australia is also a very, very large country at 7.7 million square kilometers, only 20% smaller than that of the US. It's going to be difficult for China to conquer Australia, in other words. In fact, if China really wants to get its resources, its hand on Australian resources, it's far cheaper for it to just basically buy up both BHP and Rio Tinto that could basically be had for less than $250 billion. International politics is always everyone for himself. As a result of the China-Australia spat, Chinese beef import from Australia is down 50% this year. Meanwhile, Chinese beef import from the US is up 900%. The US has become the biggest winner of the spat between Australia and China. The US is selling submarines to Australia, and the US is selling more beef to China. Who's your real friend, basically, in this business? Yellow has a special meaning for the Chinese people. In fact, Han Chinese people regard themselves as the descendants of the so-called Yellow Emperor. Yellow is also the color of the most powerful dragon in the world. Yellow has a special meaning simply because yellow is the color of the Yellow River, which was the birthplace of the Chinese civilization. Yellow is a symbol of fertility, of life itself. China is an agricultural civilization. In fact, much of China's value and philosophical system grew straight out of an agrarian society. Combined with ancestor worship, the Chinese idea of land ownership that propagates continuity of the family is sacred. Once in this system, you don't basically sell or part with the land that you inherit from your father, your grandfather, your ancestors. This is the reason why any Chinese leader under whose watch Taiwan gets its independence will go in the history book as being the worst leader ever. Now, a few words about Taiwan's association with China. Taiwan had no historical or political significance until Zheng Chenggong, a Ming Dynasty loyalist, took over the island in 1661 to resist the Qing rule. Qing eventually conquered Taiwan and annexed it in 1683. By the way, this happened nearly 200 years before U.S. annexed California, okay, after defeating Mexico in a war that the U.S. started. Many years later, Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan to create a government that he saw as being the only legitimate government of China. Except for some Aborigines, everyone in Taiwan ultimately came from China. The only difference being when they arrived in Taiwan and from which province in China they came from. In that sense, I would argue Taiwan is at least as much part of China as California is part of the United States. It's reasonable to talk about self-determination these days. But let's take the US as an example. How easy would it be for a state to actually secede from the Union? By the way, in a recent poll, 52% of Trump supporters and 41% of Biden supporters said that they would like to see their states pull out of the Union and create countries of their own. So this is not entirely a hypothetical situation. So how easy would it be for California, let's just say, to secede from the Union? Given the US Constitution has no provision for secession, it would require a US Constitution amendment, which needs to be approved by 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, it is very, very, very hard in practice if a state in the US would like to leave the Union. By the way, in Europe, let me also remind you, the former president of Catalan is currently in exile, being wanted by the Spanish government for organizing a legal referendum in 2017. I think it's fair to assume China will invade Taiwan if Taiwan were to choose to declare independence. Politically, China has the will. Military, China has the means. Ideally, of course, a successful campaign needs to be short to avoid US interventions. But if Taiwan were to declare independence, that will leave Chinese leadership with no choice. They will basically take whatever risk they have to be on the right side of the history book. The China-Taiwan relationship is a hostile one, but it's also a stable one. Because until now, Taiwan fears, invasion from China. Therefore, until now, it hasn't declared independence. China also does not want to invade Taiwan unless it absolutely has to. So until now, we've had a stalemate. However, the risk now is that the US starts to pave the way for Taiwanese independence. For example, by giving arms to Taiwan, by recognizing the Taiwanese government, or basically helping Taiwan gain access to international, organization as members, This might actually leave China with no choice but to engage in a preemptive strike. Preemptive strike only because if China in that situation were to wait longer, Taiwan might become stronger, and then it becomes more difficult for China to basically invade Taiwan. So given that the Biden administration has made one mistake after another when it comes to foreign policy, we cannot entirely rule out the possibility that the Biden administration makes such a mistake. And this is what I fear the most, including for my family that still lives in Taiwan. Update of my market views. On the US debt ceiling, Mitch McConnell agreed to a short-term extension in order to protect Joe Manchin and Sinema. I think the crisis is far from over. In fact, things are probably going to get a lot worse as we approach the new deadline in early December. I still like shorting small cap stocks. In fact, I entered a short IWN position at 220 last week. On the US economy, the September job numbers pretty much strengthen my stagflation view, And I still think, ironically, the best way to trade this view is by selling euro dollar, and I entered the position at 116. I think the Fed is the difficult place. I think ultimately they can have no choice but to basically taper, notwithstanding the poor headline job numbers. On China, the big news this week is that energy shortage is actually exacerbating the slowdown. I still think that the China slowdown story has room to play. I enter a short Richemont position at 99.4 last week. On COVID, my mind hasn't changed either. I'm still very much of the view that the FDA's decision not to give out the third booster to everyone is placing the vast majority of Americans at risk, as many of them are seeing the effectiveness of their vaccination waning, especially as we head into basically the fall. And by the way, the last couple of weeks, we've seen resurgence of the number of new cases, of all places in Vermont, which boasts of the highest vaccination rate in the country. For that reason, I enter into a long Pfizer position at $42 a share. On that note, talk to you next week.